He was the Prophet's disciple, a lion on the battlefield, and a man whom paradise had already promised. In his loyalty, he was unwavering. In combat, unmatched. But in the end, it was faith, not the sword, that defined him. This is the story of Zubair ibn al-Awwam. What would make a 15-year-old risk his life in a society where loyalty meant bloodlines, not faith? Where defying your tribe didn't just stain your name, but invited death? This is not about modern bravery. This is about Zubair ibn al-Awwam, a teenager who drew his sword for an idea, before even his city knew what that idea meant. But before we get there, you need to understand what kind of world produced someone like Zubair. 7th century Arabia was not the blinding desert simplicity we see in films. It was layered. Tribes governed your survival. Commerce and kin were inseparable, and honor wasn't a virtue. It was your oxygen. If you lost honor, you didn't just fall, you were erased. And into this stitched together quilt of loyalties and idols was born Zubair, from the prestigious Banu Asad clan of Quraysh. Sounds impressive on paper, but being born into nobility doesn't guarantee protection when you stop playing by its rules. Zubair was the cousin of Khadija, R.A., the Prophet Muhammad's first wife, which gave him proximity to both wealth and reputation. His father died young, so he was raised under the control of his uncle. This uncle held wealth, pride, and rage, all tightly wound. Zubair grew up among Quraysh's elite, but it didn't make him soft. While others found safety in tribal arrogance, Zubair began questioning things. Why do we pray to stones? Why do the strong feed on the weak? And why, in a city with divine history, has every corner sold itself to man-made power? Enter Islam. The moment he heard the Prophet speak of the oneness of God, of equality across tribe and skin, of morality over inheritance, something ancient and buried cracked open inside him. And he said yes, no hesitation. He converted. Let's pause. Because here's the twist. He didn't wait to see how things go. There was no social proof. Islam had no land at that point, no power, no allies in office. In fact, to say yes to the Prophet then was to sign your own exile letter. And Zubair signed it with his full name. So what happened after his Shahada? He was beaten by his own uncle, brutally, tied in rugs, pressed with smoke and heat. The idea was clear. Whatever fire pushed you to leave Quraysh, we will burn it out of you. But Zubair never flinched. He endured every lash, every insult, and perhaps most painfully, every silence from the friends who vanished after he said, La ilaha illa Allah. But the test hadn't even begun yet. One day, in the back alleys of old Mecca, young Zubair heard a whisper. The Prophet had been attacked. He didn't ask questions. He didn't verify. He didn't wait. He unsheathed his sword and charged. He raced barefoot through the streets of Mecca until he reached the Prophet's home, sword raised, expecting enemies, ready to fight. When the Prophet saw him, slightly confused, he said, "What's this, O Zubair?" And he answered with words not taught in training camps or warrior scrolls. He said, "I heard they were hurting you, So I brought the sword. The Prophet smiled and made dua for him. Let that moment marinate. Here is a teenage boy, without army, without status, without permission, entering the battlefield of courage before it ever officially opened. And he did it solely out of love, not for treasure, not for position. He heard the messenger might be hurt and didn't want to live in a world where he had done nothing. Pause here. Think of what Zubair models at this moment. This isn't just bravery, it's intuition rooted in conviction. This is seeing Islam not as a prize to be won, but as a promise to protect. And from that day forward, he was never seen without a sword again. Curious? It gets deeper. Zubair is not yet the general, not the Ashara Mubashara, not yet the man whose fierce discipline on campaigns earned him the Prophet's personal praise. All of that is coming. But for now, we're left with the image of a dusty sword, a quiet teenager, and a revolution that had just received one of its most reliable protectors. Uthman had wealth, Abu Bakr had diplomacy, Umar had power, Ali had wisdom, but Zubair had loyalty, and it would shape everything. Zubair didn't just keep the sword after that day, he trained with it like he was preparing not for war, but for purpose. And when war finally came, he was the first in line, not only by position, but by intention. As the Muslim community survived the economic siege of Mecca, then made the hijrah to Medina, Zubair was not just surviving, he was watching, learning, ready. He wasn't loud in gatherings like Umar, nor as diplomatically commanding as Abu Bakr. But during the days when dust and uncertainty clouded the new Medina, Zubair stood like a stone planted by faith. That's when the battles began, Badr. You've heard the name, but here's what people often miss. The Battle of Badr wasn't supposed to be a battle. It was a tactical move on a Qurayshi caravan. But the Quraysh answered with an army, armed to the teeth, outnumbering the Muslims 3-1. Medina trembled. Some wondered whether to fight or negotiate. Some froze, but not Zubair. When the Prophet called for volunteers to represent Islam in one-on-one duels ahead of the main battle, Zubair didn't just volunteer, he stepped into that arena like a lion deprived of voice. His opponent wore full armor, face completely covered. Zubair struck true, through the tiny gap in the enemy's visor. Precision, not rage. He didn't roar for glory. He examined weakness and targeted precisely. The Prophet watched this young warrior with pride and made dua. O Allah, support Zubair. He is my Hawari, my disciple, my protector. And behind the sword was focus. Zubair didn't kill for thrill. He attacked when justice demanded it. During Uhud, when the verses shifted from divine intervention to brutal consequence due to a single tactical mistake, Muslims panicked. The enemy flanked from behind, and blood poured into the dust. The Prophet was injured. Rumors flew that he had fallen. Chaos raged. But amid that chaos, Zubair surged not forward, but inward, toward the Prophet. He cut through lines, not to reach fame, but to build a wall between the messenger and death itself. His brother was martyred that day. His own wounds were many, but his hand never dropped that sword. He was not the loudest voice in strategy rooms, but when the Prophet needed a trusted eye, he sent Zubair. During the Battle of Khandak, while the Muslims were digging a trench to prevent an allied tribal invasion, a whisper spread. The tribe of Banu Qurayza had broken their treaty. Medina was now possibly under attack from within and without. The Prophet needed confirmation, but it couldn't be leaked. Who do you send? A man who's brave enough to walk into near betrayal, smart enough to read intentions, and discreet enough to never reveal secrets. Zubair was sent, and when he returned, he said, "The wind is blowing from the gates of treachery." There was no drama, just data spoken with fire beneath. This balance of loyalty and intelligence is what made Zubair necessary, not just in the Prophet's life, but in the future of the Ummah. While other companions engaged in fierce debates, Zubair often stood silently, and when he did speak, every opinion was drawn with the same precision as his blade. That's why later Umar would add him to the Shura, the elite 6 companions tasked with shaping the caliphate after his death. He once said, "If I were to die suddenly, and you had only Zubair to follow, you would not go astray." Let's step back. What kind of man ends up loved by the Prophet, trusted by Umar, respected by Ali, and feared by the Roman and Persian generals alike? What makes someone both a warrior and a wall? Perhaps it was the motive. Zubair didn't fight for Islam because it won. He fought because it was true, even when it had no supporters, no stability, and no safety net. He believed, before it was safe to believe, and held on after the world bent under him. But perhaps his greatest courage wasn't in battle at all. It was during moments of tension, when friends became political opponents, when old alliances frayed, when loyalty became blurry. That test comes later. But even in his martyrdom, Zubair would prove he understood one truth better than most. The sword is only as noble as the heart that draws it. This was not just a man. This was a system of courage walking in silence. No theatrics, no banners, no throne. Just a lifelong echo of one decision: to live and die in the service of something greater than himself. Imagine migrating to a city where no one owes you anything. No title, no land, no army, just your faith and the fire it attracts. Zubair ibn al-Awwam had left Mecca behind, the city of his roots, the streets that once carried the sound of his uncle's whips. He left not to escape, but to build a new order in Medina, one where truth would outlive tribe. But that truth required protection, from the inside and from the outside. The Prophet's arrival in Medina didn't fix everything. It invited complexity. The Muhajirun, those who migrated from Mecca, were jobless. The Ansar, Madinan supporters, had opened their homes to them. Economically, it was pressure. Socially, it was friction. On top of that came the growing hostility of Quraysh, vowing to crush the seed before it could grow. So how do you preserve something fragile with no fortress? You send men like Zubair. From the moment the Prophet began preparing for the possibility of conflict, Zubair was present, not with commentary, but with certainty. In every early strategic meeting, he sat quietly, sword resting near his shoulder, eyes sharper than the blade. He didn't question the Prophet's plans. He waited patiently for the moment when plans needed protectors. Then came Badr. It was supposed to be a caravan interception, a quick logistical maneuver to hurt Quraysh's trade routes. Instead, it became the stage for the first full war between Islam and its enemies. The Muslims were desperately underprepared. 3 and 15 men with only 2 horses and a handful of swords. Quraysh had almost 1,000 fighters and the confidence of legacy, but they did not have Zubair. As battle lines formed, The Prophet laid out the command. He asked who would step forward first for single combat. Zubair didn't move like a showman. He stepped forward like a debt had just been due. Fully armored, face hidden behind a bold yellow turban, he stared into the center of Quraysh's vanguard. Among their champions stood a warrior whose name whispered fear. Zubair didn't flinch. They clashed. The duel was sharp, not extended. Zubair analyzed rather than attacked. He found the opening near the enemy's neck, a small flaw in the armor seam, and his blade answered. The enemy collapsed. The Prophet smiled. Zubair's sword is covered by angels, he said. For the rest of Zubair's life, he wore that same yellow turban into battle. It wasn't personal branding, it was memory wrapped around purpose. But Badr was only battle won. Then came Uhud. This is where complexity enters. Because Uhud wasn't just a loss militarily, it was a test emotionally. After an early Muslim advantage, a breach in Muslim discipline led to Quraysh circling behind. Absolute chaos followed. Arrows pierced shields. Dust glazed over vision. Some believed the Prophet had fallen. Others froze. Some fled. Zubair did neither. He located the Prophet amidst the smoke, saw his body covered in wounds, blood filling his mouth, and realized retreat was not an option. He carved through Quraysh ranks, not for glory, not for revenge, but to build a human wall with his own limbs and bones. Alongside Talha, Abu Dujana, and others, Zubair helped cocoon the Prophet. From final death, he received multiple wounds. His own brother fell in the battle. And when the sun set on that battlefield, the Muslims had taken a blow that hurt in legacy and morale. But not men like Zubair. He didn't lash out. He didn't criticize others. He didn't use his courage as currency. He went silent. Then he went to the Prophet's tent and asked if there was anything else he could do. That's the difference. Some men are brave during the fight. Zubair was brave after it failed. That's harder. Now pause here. You might expect a man like this to seek power in council rooms. But Zubair stayed on the front lines, not just in battle, but in faith. He lived like the sword he carried, balanced, sharpened only when needed. His principle wasn't fearlessness, it was control. Then came Khandak. The Battle of the Trench did not follow the usual rules. This was psychological warfare. Quraysh had gathered multiple tribes in what resembled a Confederate army, intent on obliterating Medina. But instead of open field battle, the Muslims dug a trench through the city's vulnerable regions, combining tactics with trust in Allah's plan. Zubair once again stood in the thick of it, this time as a scout, spy, and protector. The Prophet asked for a volunteer to gather intelligence from the increasingly suspicious Banu Qurayza tribe, rumored to be preparing betrayal from within. Only one man rose, Zubair, and not just once. He was sent 3 times, each more dangerous than the last. The Prophet watched him return each time, cloak dusted, eyes calm, words efficient. Then came the moment. In a gathering filled with companions, the Prophet stood, eyes scanning the faces of believers. Then his gaze softened and he said, "Every prophet has a Hawari, a disciple, a shield bearer, and mine is Zubair ibn al-Awwam, not sword, not champion, disciple. Do you see the wisdom?" The Prophet didn't elevate Zubair as merely muscle. He saw him as support, emotional, strategic, spiritual support. because that's what Zubair had become. A man whose sword cut enemies, but whose heart protected prophecy. Zubair's presence in battle wasn't just physical, it was principled. He enforced not only justice through his sword, but the Prophet's commands through his discipline. He didn't chase after retreating enemies just to add one more name to his record. He didn't strike corpses. He didn't cut down trees or loot villages. Even when the enemy mocked from afar, Zubair stayed grounded. This was not a man trying to win duels for sport. This was a man trying to please God while protecting the Ummah. That mindset became crucial in an era when the standard of morality could be erased by battlefield victory. Zubair never let that happen. His restraint revealed more strength than his aggression. His most dangerous weapon wasn't the blade, it was the quiet limits he drew around it. And there was more than one battlefield. Zubair carried more than steel. The Prophet often assigned him to intelligence gathering, to defense posts, and to escort roles during high-risk migrations. He was there when Fatima's marriage to Ali was arranged. He was present in the inner circle during delicate negotiations, including situations with tribes that required deep listening and sharp instinct. You don't put someone like Zubair on every mission unless you trust his judgment completely. And the Prophet trusted him as much for his silence as for his strength. During the Battle of Hunain, when the Muslims were caught in a surprise ambush, Zubair was among the few who didn't flee. There's a pattern here. When others hesitated, Zubair moved forward, and when others surged hotly, he held back with control. That duality, courage and conscience, made him one of the Prophet's most dependable assets. When the Prophet passed away, and the world of Medina tilted under the weight of grief and transition, Zubair did not rush to claim leadership, nor did he fade into retreat. He stayed watching, steady as ever, but even in training others, he showed that stability. Zubair's son, Abdullah ibn Zubair, once begged his father to let him enter battle as a child. Zubair refused, not because he doubted his son's courage, but because he respected the integrity of warfare. Battle is not sport, it's a weight, he said. Blood is never just spilled, it's accounted for in the sight of God. These weren't dramatic speeches, they were quiet codes. Codes that Zubair lived by until the end. Perhaps one of the most telling moments of Zubair's inner clarity came not in battle, but in a brief, sorrowful flash toward the end of the Prophet's life. During the final illness of the Prophet, Zubair didn't advocate for recognition or invitation into power circles. He remained in prayer, providing food, support, and presence. And when the Prophet finally passed, Zubair wept, as did every companion worth his salt. But he didn't turn that grief into division. He watched, waited, reacted only when the Ummah needed unity more than emotion. Zubair's ethics in these incredibly tense periods became his armor. Think about it. He witnessed the revelation of more than 20 Quranic chapters. He fought in over a dozen official deployments. He survived political collapse, civil protests, trials against caliphs, and watched companions rise and fall. Yet through all that, his principles never cracked. He never sought a position he wasn't qualified for. He never took advantage of the Prophet's praise, and he never weaponized his proximity to power for political gain. Here's the paradox that's worth reflecting on. Some warriors are remembered for how many enemies they defeated. Zubair is remembered for how deeply he believed before anyone else did. Abu Bakr was the bridge between tribes. Umar was the hammer of law. Ali was the door to knowledge. Zubair Zubair was the lock that kept hypocrisy out when nobody else had the key. Toward the end of his life, Zubair became more quiet. His voice was soft in Madinan councils. His hands prayed more than they trained. His sword gathered dust, not because he lost interest, but because he feared it would be drawn by the wrong motives in a changing time. Those final years set up a tragedy we'll come to soon. But one thing is clear. By the time civil war lured him out of retirement, he had already proven the essence of his character. So when the Prophet said, "Every prophet has a Hawari, my Hawari is Zubair," he wasn't praising just the body of a fighter. He was praising the mind of a disciple. Hawari wasn't an easy term. It meant someone who steps forward when others step back. Someone who shields the messenger's message long after the messenger is gone. Someone whose sword cuts only when the soul says it must. Zubair didn't simply fight for Islam. Zubair helped define what it means to fight for it morally. That's what made him the warrior of dual realms, of the battlefield, and of the heart. What happens when two heroes, raised beside the Prophet, taught by revelation, forged together in fire, one day find themselves standing on opposite ends of a battlefield they never wanted? This isn't the story of enemies. It's the story of brotherhood built in faith and broken by history. Zubair ibn al-Awwam and Ali ibn Abi Talib weren't just great companions. They were a fusion of strength and stillness, courage and knowledge, forged in the Prophet's lifetime and sealed in loyalty. Their roots ran deep. Both born into nobility, both cousins of the Prophet, both among the earliest to embrace Islam before it held any power. Zubair accepted Islam as a teenager, Ali at an even younger age. And while Ali grew up in the Prophet's direct guardianship, Zubair was among the first to shield him with steel. Where Ali mastered the pen of thought and the sword of truth, Zubair was the blade that spoke only when absolutely necessary. Their personalities were different, but their purpose was identical. In the early days of the Medinan state, their synergy was unmistakable. In councils, both advocated for justice even when others hesitated. In war, their names appeared together in records, not just in the line of soldiers, but in the strategic command. During the most critical battles, Zubair and Ali often shared the same assignments: defense perimeter planning, duels in chaos, and flanking operations that required both strength and discipline. The Prophet didn't pair them only because of skill, but because of trust. They complemented each other. Ali's decisive mind and eloquent clarity, Zubair's unwavering instinct and quick action. Together, they weren't just commanders. They were extensions of the Prophet's vision of a just ummah. Think back to Badr, Uhud, Khandak, Khaybar, the names that echo through early Islamic military history. You'll find Zubair and Ali in all of them, not on opposite sides of ideas, but standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the same banner. In Khandak, while the trench stalled Quraysh forces, whispers of internal betrayal echoed. The Prophet needed men who could face the tension of treachery without igniting it into civil chaos. He sent Zubair and Ali on rotation, each entrusted to report, not react. That's how tight the bond of trust was, and it wasn't limited to logistics or combat. During the Prophet's final illness, when emotions were raw, when succession had not yet been resolved, Zubair remained respectful of Ali's elevated status in the Prophet's family. He showed deference. When heated debates dissolved friendships after the Prophet's departure, Zubair's relationship with Ali remained intact. He didn't join rebellion. He didn't claim leadership. He watched, listened, and supported where appropriate. In fact, when the Shura Council of Umar ibn al-Khattab met to choose the next caliph, both Ali and Zubair were members of that inner consultation. They debated, they disagreed, but even in disagreement, they never disrespected. There are moments in early Islamic records where Ali would reference Zubair with reverence, and Zubair would call Ali the tongue of truth and the blade of the righteous. These weren't shallow phrases. They were reflections of a decades-long brotherhood rooted in shared struggle. Both gave from their wealth. Both stood up when others sat down. Both carried the memory of the Prophet not as nostalgia, but as responsibility. So how did these two lions of Islam eventually wind up on different paths? That's the tragic question that looms in every study of Islamic history, and it never has a simple answer. To understand it, you must understand that Zubair and Ali didn't part because of greed or betrayal. They parted because the world around them shifted faster than principles could adapt. After the assassinations of earlier caliphs, trust fractured. Power was shifting through grief, not clarity. People saw enemies in places where there were only questions. Zubair didn't turn against Ali. He turned toward what he believed was justice. And Ali didn't seek to fight Zubair. He sought to preserve unity and was heartbroken when it faltered. History often punishes the righteous by forcing them into positions where every option cuts deep. That moment came for Ali and Zubair, not in courts or council chambers, but on the road to Basra. After the assassination of Caliph Uthman ibn Affan, the Muslim world entered its most painful political test. The unity the Prophet had bled to build was now unraveling, thread by thread, city by city. Grief had turned into blame, and in the vacuum of clarity, justice became subjective. Ali was appointed caliph, reluctantly. He accepted not out of ambition, but because refusal could fracture the ummah further. Zubair, like many senior companions, had deep respect for Ali's leadership, but there remained one question. What about the murder of Uthman? The blood was still fresh. Medina was shaken. The killers still roamed. And the masses wanted answers. Talha and Aisha also raised concern. The cry wasn't for war, it was for accountability. Zubair didn't oppose Ali as a man. He questioned the weight of silence in the face of injustice. And so, under a banner of seeking justice for Uthman's assassination, Zubair, Talha, and Aisha moved with armies toward Basra. The goal was not confrontation, it was clarity. But clarity in times of civil tension is a luxury. From the moment they left Medina, observers read their movement in different ways. Some saw rebellion, others saw justice. Most saw chaos inching forward. Zubair's heart was heavy. This wasn't the kind of campaign he was used to. He had marched against idolatry, against treachery, against open threats to Islam, never against someone who once covered the Prophet's body in battle. But once politics gains momentum, it doesn't stop easily. When the armies of Ali and Zubair camped near Basra, tension thickened. Both sides stalled, not wanting to initiate bloodshed. Even then, Ali reached out through letters, messengers, and personal conversation. And then came the moment. Ali met Zubair face to face. No swords, no announcements. Just two brothers of the Prophet's inner circle, standing in a desert now filled with men shaking in confusion. Ali looked at Zubair and asked quietly, "Do you remember what the Messenger of Allah said to you, Zubair? That you would one day fight me and you would be in the wrong?" Zubair paused. He remembered, and everything shifted. This single conversation didn't lead to ego. It led to realization. Zubair realized that although his intentions were pure, his path had become misaligned. He made a decision right there. He would not fight. He would leave the battlefield. The cause was no longer just. It was tangled in perceptions beyond control. Zubair withdrew from the camp. He walked out, not as a traitor to his party, but as a man choosing moral clarity over emotional loyalty. He rode out to a quiet valley outside of Basra. He stopped to pray. It was there that fate, once again, proved cruel to the sincere. A man named Ibn Jurmuz, holding on to loyalty to the chaos, rather than to character, followed Zubair and assassinated him while he was in sujud. A man who had shielded the Prophet with his own body was struck down while speaking to the same Lord they both defended. Ibn Jurmuz took Zubair's sword and brought it to Ali, thinking he would be praised, but Ali didn't smile. He held the sword with trembling hands. This was the very sword that had never failed in protecting the Prophet. This was Zubair, his brother in battle, in blood, in belief. Ali wept. He looked at the assassin and said something that shook the earth more than any political slogan. "Give glad tidings of hell to the killer of Zubair." No sides justified this. No cause protected it. No banner could make sense of it. It was wrong. Ali later said, "Zubair was of us, a man of purity, a man of bravery, a martyr, even though some call him an opponent." In that line, you hear truth rise above politics. That's the tragedy of history. Sometimes people with the same Quran in their hearts, the same tears for the Prophet in their eyes, get pulled into opposite sides, not out of hate, but out of wounded judgment. Zubair didn't die because he betrayed. He died because he hesitated, corrected, and chose to leave a fight that had already gone too far. History might write that they stood on opposite sides, but legacy says they stood beside the Prophet, and that will always come first. After the Prophet passed away, and Abu Bakr's lightning leadership held the Ummah from unraveling, a steady hand was needed, someone who feared power more than he craved it. That man was Umar ibn al-Khattab. When he became caliph, it marked a new era of steel and simplicity. But more importantly, it revealed something about Zubair. Because when Umar formed the Shura, the inner circle to advise him on matters that would shape the map of the world, one of the first names he wrote down was Zubair ibn al-Awwam. Zubair wasn't a loud politician. He wasn't a tribal manipulator or a man known for business consensus. So why did Umar trust him? Simple. Because when Umar needed someone who would tell the truth without flattery, guard the Ummah without ego, and call for justice without delay, he called Zubair. In councils, Zubair didn't speak often. But when he did, decisions slowed. People listened. He was honest to the bone, known for answering questions with caution, not charisma. In sessions where military strategy was debated, he cut straight, through emotion. He didn't want tribal power. He wanted victory, to last, not echo. During the campaigns of Egypt and Greater Syria, Umar appointed generals with surgical thought. Front lines needed fighters, but more than that, they needed men who wouldn't collapse afterward. That's where Zubair came in. After Khalid ibn al-Walid cracked through Iraq and Bilad al-Sham, and Amr ibn al-As advanced into Egypt, Zubair was brought into the decisive campaigns, not to lead them alone, but to calculate, stabilize, and cleanly execute delicate victories. Zubair understood conquest better than most. He was not seduced by land. He judged everything by a higher court. Was this move just? Would it bring mercy? Could he face the Prophet on the day of judgment and say, "We went this far and no farther"? In Egypt, Amr ibn al-As was pressing hard. The Byzantines had fortified themselves in Babylon fortress. Victory was reachable, but not breaking through. Umar dispatched reinforcements, including Zubair. His arrival was not dramatic. He didn't give speeches. He walked the ground, studied elevation, noted the openings in their defensive lines. Then one night, scaling the wall directly, Zubair led an assault team that neutralized a corner watchtower and burst open the fortress gates. The momentum shifted. Egypt cracked open. Muslims took the city. And what did Zubair do after? He didn't frame himself as the liberator of Egypt. He refused wealth, rejected gifts, declined political land grabs. Everything fell back to Medina. Someone once said to him, "The spoils are right there. No one will know." Zubair shook his head. Even if no one sees, Allah records. That defined him. For many, war brings out greed. For Zubair, it brought out restraint. He never slept in governor houses. He never changed clothes to elevate rank. Despite access to enormous public funds, Zubair's private life remained as modest as his Meccan youth. His homes were made of clay and palm branches. His armor was old. He still used the same yellow turban from Barda. This wasn't romanticized myth. It was fact confirmed across every generation. Umar once walked into Zubair's dwelling and stopped. No servants, no lavish lighting, just a sword hung by leather, a blanket, and a Quran on the shelf. Umar paused and said, "We have all changed, except you." Even his family carried this legacy. Zubair's children were known for discipline. His son, Abdullah ibn Zubair, famous for his own political rise later, once wanted to push for glory too early. Zubair warned him, "You can win a crowd with fire, but you can only please Allah with balance." And Zubair embodied that balance in every mission Umar gave him. He didn't overthrow Damascus with belligerence. He didn't burn temples. Churches remained protected. No woman was harmed. No civilian market looted. Him and the other companions carried the Prophet's instruction into war. Do not destroy the homes of the innocent. Do not harm the weak. Do not violate treaties. Begin with dawah. End with peace. Zubair took that seriously. In one battle, after the enemy fled, warriors began collecting items from abandoned homes. Zubair walked in, saw the act, and said one phrase: "Put it back or pray your salat elsewhere." This was Zubair in the field. Not only strong with the sword, but strong enough to tell his own side when they were wrong. That's rarer than victory, and that's what Umar saw in him. It's easy to win battles, harder to win the aftermath. That's where Zubair shined. Warriors often collapse in corridors of power, tempted by the spoils, distracted by the praise, softened by the scrolls bearing their names. Zubair didn't. He returned from each campaign lighter, not heavier. He brought back memories, not merchandise. When officials offered him governorships over the conquered territories in Egypt or Syria, he declined. "I did not fight, so my name becomes a stamp on state letters," he said. "I fought to guard something the sword can't reach, the trust of Rasulullah." That single sentence explains his whole discipline. Zubair knew power smells different after victory. It starts sweet, then becomes sticky, then suffocating. He refused to breathe it in. That's why Umar could count on him. Not to flatter him, but to correct him. Not to beg for promotions, but to guard justice even when it hurt. In one public dispute over a damaged wall between two properties, Zubair and another citizen approached Umar. The dispute was simple. Whose land did the water flow belong to? But because it was Zubair, Umar ruled against him, saying, "Others might think I favored you." Zubair didn't complain. He nodded and walked away. That story spread far, and it did more for public trust than 10 sermons could, because Zubair, the famous companion, had just lost a civil case and still said, "Alhamdulillah." Compare that to today's leaders who scream, "Do you know who I am?" Zubair knew exactly who he was, and that's why he feared his own ego more than any judge. When people came to him for religious or legal advice, he never spoke without trembling. He once said, "I fear saying a thing about Allah without knowledge, more than I fear standing alone in 1,000 versus 1 battle." His judgment wasn't loud. It was layered in thought, soaked in humility, then spoken in half the words others would use. Under Umar, with borders now stretching into Persia and the Levant, Zubair never faded into background. He was dispatched strategically, not just to fight, but to help consolidate trust wherever Muslims passed through. His name became a guarantee. People said, "If Zubair is with them, we know they're not raiders. They're an army with rules." Even non-Muslims learned his firmness had fairness. Church leaders remembered him as the warrior who never interrupted services. Jewish tribal elders remembered that his troops didn't enter synagogues without invitation. Zubair's sword stopped at the limits the Prophet once praised him for, and he didn't broadcast this. He didn't document it. He lived it. One night, in a field outside Jabiya, after the Muslims had secured what was now modern Syria, companions found Zubair sleeping under a tree, no cloak, no guard, just leaning on one arm, sword resting near his leg, breath steady. They asked why he didn't sleep in the tent. He said, "The stars have no doors. When I'm beneath them, I remember how small I am." That humility wasn't private. It bled into his public design. Even when the Diwan, state registry, began listing financial entitlements for veterans, Zubair refused to take more than basic needs. Umar insisted, "You've earned more than that." Zubair replied, "What if Allah says, I took my reward?" Here, he understood weight. Every coin felt heavy. Every decision needed prayer. In today's standards, Zubair was underpaid, underquoted, and undercelebrated. But in the heavens, he was rising. Rising because he chose absence over arrogance. Because after his victories, when others hosted feasts, Zubair hosted dhikr circles. After every campaign, he asked one question, not to the public, but to himself. Did we leave the people better than we found them? If the answer was no, he wept that night. That's the paradox of Zubair. Sharp as steel in battle, soft as silk in self-accountability. Given access to empires, but never once stepped into governance like he owned it. This is why scholars later called him one of the cleanest warriors in Islamic history. Not for his bloodshed, but for how he traversed that field without letting it infect his soul. He wasn't perfect. He never claimed to be. But what made him great was that he sought to be forgiven before he sought to be praised. Even his victories were painted with repentance. In Egypt, in Syria, in every fortress where his sandals left dust on marble, he left something more enduring than strategy. He left respect. When Umar ibn al-Khattab stood on the edge of death and looked toward the next chapter of the caliphate, he didn't hand his rule to a single successor. He trusted 6 men, the Shura, to choose warriors, thinkers, men who had fought beside the Prophet and stayed true during storms. Among them stood Zubair ibn al-Awwam, the man who had refused title, who never demanded voice, was now invited into the circle of decision where legacies are shaped. But make no mistake, Zubair didn't walk in thinking about power. He walked in thinking about preservation. His concern wasn't who would lead, it was whether the Ummah would survive disagreement. Inside the Shura, the air cracked with tension. On one side stood Ali ibn Abi Talib, intellectual, brave, tied to the Prophet by blood and belief. On the other stood Uthman ibn Affan, elder, wealthy, generous, with deep ties to the dominant Qurayshi clans. Both men were worthy, but the factions circling around them whispered different futures. Zubair didn't fuel the heat, he didn't lobby, he didn't campaign or whisper. His record spoke already. He had stood beside both candidates in battle, bled for the same principles, and knew that either could lead with vision. But in the end, Uthman was chosen, and Zubair accepted it. He didn't just accept it, he honored it. Loyalty isn't tested when your opinion wins. It's tested when it doesn't. Zubair believed in Shura. He believed in senior consultation, in collective decision-making, in the principle that the greater good must triumph over personal preference. And so, when Uthman took the reins, Zubair didn't distance himself. He stayed close, not to influence, but to observe. He watched as Uthman tried to lead a new generation that didn't remember the Meccan boycott or the sweat of Badr, a generation that saw Islam as an empire, not a resistance. This period was different. Expansion had made Islam global. Rulers now sat over vast multicultural lands. Governors once chosen for righteousness were being tested by comfort and distance. As provinces grew more complex, local grievances piled up. Some accused Uthman of being too lenient, too generous to family, too slow to correct his inner circle. But the lines weren't drawn in sand. They were drawn on loyalties shaped years ago. And Medina, once quiet, began to murmur. Zubair watched carefully. He sensed it. Tension in Egypt, restlessness in Iraq, frustration in distant Yemen. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about expectations. The people wanted authority they could reach. Uthman was kind, but kindness wasn't silent correction. Some of his administrators acted with arrogance. Treaties were delayed. Public funds questioned. Instead of removing such figures early, Uthman forgave. A noble act, but one that fed fires no one had predicted. Zubair wasn't in opposition, but he began to feel increasingly out of place. A man of the sword, now among men of spreadsheets. When crowds began protesting at the mosque, it dawned on him. Medina was changing. Respect for the companions remained, but the new generation questioned openly. If you fought with the Prophet, one young man said, then why are you silent when governors loot the treasury? Zubair didn't respond with fire. He walked away, because legacy, to him, isn't defended by yelling. It's preserved with example. As Medina trembled, calls for resistance grew. Certain tribes began to rally quietly. They saw a vacuum forming. Zubair, known for his tribal influence, could have taken command. He had the military record. He had public trust. His name echoed across Egypt and Sham, but he refused tribal manipulation. Politicians whispered that a small push from him could dethrone Uthman, or at least tilt the power. He declined. Leadership sought is a fire. Leadership given is a trust, he warned. And I do not chase fire. What's extraordinary is what he did during the Medina unrest. When protesters marched near Uthman's home, fists filled. With outrage, tongues with verse claiming they stood for justice, Zubair stood between both. He didn't pick sides. He told the protesters to go home, stay patient, let Shura do its work. Then he turned to Uthman's inner circle and said, "Speak less, listen more. Their anger has roots." But the moment of no return had arrived. Zubair had seen political storms. He had seen Quraysh roar in Mecca, armies form in the desert, and tribes splinter under pressure. But nothing prepared him for what happened next. The siege of Uthman's home was not a foreign invasion. It was an internal wound. Young idealists and tribal agitators, some sincere, some not, surrounded the caliph's house, demanding reform, then threatening revolution. Many senior companions were away, but Zubair was there, and he, along with Ali, Talha, and others, tried to negotiate between both sides. They carried water through the crowds. They told the protesters to fear Allah. They told the caliph to address grievances clearly. But between those two calls stood fire, and no one knew who would be burned first. Zubair entered Uthman's house days before the final blow. He found the aging caliph reciting Quran, worn, eyes steady. "These are your people," Uthman said, "but they do not know what they do." Zubair asked if he could organize a defense. Uthman declined. He didn't want more blood. He told them he would rather die than let Muslims destroy each other in his name. That broke Zubair, because he, like Talha, like Ali, recognized that Uthman wasn't resisting correction. He was resisting civil war. And then the unthinkable happened. While others thought time would calm the crowd, a faction broke in. They attacked. Uthman was reciting the Quran when they murdered him, the pages soaking in his blood. And with that, Medina collapsed into a silence more terrifying than war. Zubair didn't speak for days after it happened. He wept, not just for Uthman, but for what the Ummah had just lost. The generation that believed in rising with swords might never understand the cost of losing a man who refused to let one be drawn, even if it meant his death. In the weeks that followed, Medina became a city of contradictions. Some called for vengeance, others for unity. Tribes mobilized, allegiances flexed. Uthman's supporters blamed Ali. Ali blamed the chaos and slow justice. The Prophet's city, which once birthed light, now dimmed between voices speaking at once. Through all of this, Zubair withdrew, not from concern, but from confusion. He trusted Ali. He respected him deeply, but he also felt torn. Uthman's blood was still warm. His assassins were still alive. And the new political climate had not delivered justice. It had only delivered speed. Still, when many pledged allegiance to Ali ibn Abi Talib as the next caliph, Zubair did too, initially. Because he believed that in times of fracture, better a known just man lead than the state dissolve completely. But his oath came with hesitation, a quiet condition, a concern that justice would not be rushed. When justice didn't arrive as expected, and governance stalled between debate and delay, opposition began to form. This tension wasn't born of greed, it was born of pain. Talha, Aisha, and eventually Zubair began aligning again, not to dismantle the caliphate, but to demand action against the killers of Uthman. That alignment would take them on the road to Basra. That story belongs to another chapter. But what matters here is this. Zubair didn't want power. He didn't want rebellion. He wanted peace with accountability, a return to the balance they'd risked their lives to build in Mecca and maintained in the golden years of Medina. But the world had changed. This wasn't Abu Bakr's counsel anymore. This wasn't Umar's firm hand atop a unified sword. This was passion without stagecraft, vengeance wrapped in slogans, and old companions walking into decisions blurred by public hunger for resolution. Zubair had always been a man of solutions, but here, there wasn't one. What remained was weight. The weight of witnessing everything you protected divide. The weight of loyalty clashing with loyalty. The weight of stepping forward, knowing the sands under your feet were no longer sacred, but sinking. He once said during this time, while staring into a crowd arguing over who was right, "This is the moment men forget the fire they stood through for prophecy and begin to fight over its shadow." These weren't just political days for Zubair, they were heartbreak years, not because he lost authority, but because he saw the house of faith echoing with the sounds of a storm he couldn't stop. After Uthman's assassination, the Ummah didn't collapse, it cracked, not with fire, but with silence. Medina became a city trembling beneath reverence and rage. One group wept, wishing they could reverse what had been done. Another group wanted blood, demanding justice for a caliph they believed had been wronged. Into that vacuum stepped Ali ibn Abi Talib, reluctant, grieving, apprehensive. He was accepted as caliph by many, but not all in unison. The wound of Uthman's murder hadn't healed. And worse yet, the killers had not been punished. That absence of closure wasn't political, it was spiritual. Men who had fought beside the Prophet were now divided over how to interpret loyalty. Zubair ibn al-Awwam stood among them. When Ali was appointed, Zubair didn't rebel. He hesitated, not in hatred, but in humanity. His heart leaned toward unity. His conscience leaned toward accountability. The new state moved quickly, but the scars moved slowly. Zubair gave his pledge, but it was conditional. He wanted time. Time to see what Ali would do with justice. Time to see if the murderers would be named, judged, and removed. But Ali had a different plan. Stabilize first, uproot chaos gradually, pause before persecution. A wise goal perhaps, but for companions still burning from Uthman's death, it looked like delay. Talha shared that hesitation. Aisha, mother of the believers, voiced what many were whispering across Iraq and Egypt. Where is justice for Uthman? The three did not start as rebels. They started as loyalists to the very foundation Ali was trying to maintain. But their delay turned to distance, and that distance turned into decision. Zubair, Talha, and Aisha aligned, not to overthrow Ali, but to pressure the system, demand justice, and awaken the caliphate to its inner wound. Their destination would be Basra, but the road wasn't clear. Along the journey, every step birthed more confusion than clarity. New tribes joined, not for justice, but for power. Voices entered the ranks that remembered neither Bada nor the Prophet's gaze. It became difficult to tell who marched for righteousness and who marched for relevance. Zubair noticed this early. He didn't like it. He didn't trust the noise, but he believed in the mission, and that belief led him forward. Along the way, he and Aisha had conversations filled with tears. They remembered the days of light, the tent in Hudaybiyah, the sound of Quran at night, barely fluttering from the Prophet's lips. They had shared too many memories to imagine this kind of present. But pain has a way of distorting noble men into weary ones. Basra grew closer. So did confrontation. Ali, on the other side, didn't sit still. He too moved with forces just as, confused. He reached out, sent messengers, proposed meetings before swords. And then it finally happened. Zubair and Ali met. No guards, no battalions, just time, friendship, and a silence that had hung between them far too long. Ali looked at Zubair and said softly, "Do you remember what the Messenger of Allah once told you? That you will fight a man wrongfully, and that man will be me." Zubair froze. His memory shattered through fog and brought back a moment long ago, when they had both sat with the Prophet, younger, less broken, and these words were spoken. He remembered now, not only the prophecy, but the tone. The Prophet's sadness when he said it. Zubair stood in silence, then turned, made wudu, and prayed 2 rak'ahs. He returned to his tent, gathered his sword, told Talha, told Aisha, told his son he would not fight. This wasn't weakness, it was remembrance, the kind that doesn't shake the hand, it shakes the soul. He mounted his horse and began riding out, retracting from the battlefield that was no longer a place of justice, but thundering with fog. Now pause. Can you imagine this moment? A general, a disciple, a lion of Islam, walking away from war, not because he feared death, but because he feared being on the wrong side of a story that was bigger than him. He wasn't running, he was stepping back into light, but fate doesn't always allow clean exits. Zubair rode away from the chaos. His heart was heavy, but his steps were light, because for the first time in weeks, maybe months, his conscience felt still. He had remembered the Prophet's words. He had walked away from political noise, away from unintended rebellion, away from a war he wanted no part in. The companions who had once stood shoulder to shoulder at Bada were now separated by wounds they never meant to cause. Yet Zubair hoped that choosing to leave would be counted as repentance before Allah, that his silence would soften the noise. But not everyone was ready to let him go. Someone followed him, a man named Ibn Jurmuz, a name unknown to most of history until this moment. A man who misunderstood loyalty and wrapped it around cruelty. Seeing Zubair alone, away from the army, he saw not a noble exit, but an opportunity. This wasn't about truth or justice. It was about making a name in the haze of confusion. He approached Zubair during prayer. They exchanged few words. Zubair, as always, led with manners. But Judas never arrived screaming, while Zubair stood in sujood, prostrating to the very Lord who had once sent him to war for Barda, who had praised him through the prophet's tongue and written his name among the 10 given paradise. Ibn Jurmuz struck, cold, cowardly, and final. The man who had lifted swords, not for conquest, but for trust. The man who stepped away from civil war so he wouldn't mistake chaos for justice. The man who raised a son to carry his legacy with dignity, now fell in a quiet valley, alone, face in the sand, returning to the one he never betrayed. Ibn Jurmuz took Zubair's sword and rode toward Ali's camp, perhaps expecting reward. A seat among the righteous, recognition for ending a potential threat. But Ali, the Caliph, the cousin of the Prophet, and the one who had shared command, prayer, and memory with Zubair, didn't smile. He didn't honor the killer. He took the sword with trembling hands and repeated words that fell like thunder. Give glad tidings of hell to the man who killed Zubair. There was no joy in this, only pain layered upon pain. Even in political disagreement, Ali still loved him. He still remembered the night skies of Medina, the shared meals in the Prophet's home, the echo of swords in battle where they stood with backs to each other, never against. Zubair didn't die because he wanted fame. He died because he walked away too late from people who never understood what he protected. He died not while giving orders, but while asking Allah for answers. That was always his default. When words failed, he prayed. He never fought for power. He fought to defend the message. And when the message was safe, he stood back. Ali mourned him as a martyr, not just in poetry, but in refusal. He refused the assassin's presence in his ranks. He didn't bury the killer among his soldiers. He made no excuses. Because justice without truth is just vengeance. And Ali knew Zubair's truth. History now sees Zubair as part of the opposition in the Battle of the Camel. But titles don't always tell the truth. Zubair didn't oppose Ali's caliphate. He opposed how quickly justice had been buried beneath politics. His legacy was not defined by the battle's smoke, but by the clarity that made him step out of it. And yet, he was human. He hesitated before withdrawing. He waited for the signs. He recalled the hadith only when it was almost too late. That's the tragedy. He wanted to do right, and he nearly did everything right. But fate holds secrets, and sometimes the cleanest lives are ended not with full parades or speeches, but with a single unjust sword far away from the crowd, during a quiet prayer. Zubair's death tore through the generation who knew him, not because they were surprised, but because they realized if even someone like Zubair could fall in such a way, then this dunya really has no favorites. He wasn't buried with ceremony. He didn't get state honors, but his name never faded. The Prophet once said, "Every prophet has a Hawari. My Hawari is Zubair." That title didn't die in the battlefield. It entered the grave with him. And the sword of Zubair, the one given at Barda, covered by angels according to the Prophet's dua, was passed from hand to hand, not as a weapon, but as a memory, a reminder that even the greatest warriors are still servants of something higher. Zubair's greatest victory wasn't in Barda or Khandak or Egypt. It was the moment he remembered the Prophet's warning and walked away. Chapter 7. Hero's End. Betrayal on the river. The weight of solitude. The morning sun cast long shadows across the banks of Wadi al-Siba as Zubair ibn al-Awwam sought solitude away from the camps of war. The great companion of the Prophet, the man who had once scaled the walls of fortresses with fearless determination, now carried a different kind of weight, the crushing burden of a decision that had torn his very soul. For weeks, the armies had faced each other across the desert plains near Basra. On one side stood Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, backed by thousands who saw him as the rightful caliph. On the other side, Aisha, the beloved wife of the Prophet, alongside Talha and Zubair, demanding justice for the murder of Uthman ibn Affan. But something had changed in Zubair's heart. The fire that had once burned bright for this cause had dimmed to flickering embers of doubt. He had come to realize that this conflict, this fitna, was not the righteous struggle he had initially believed it to be. This was not a battle between good and evil, but a tragedy where good men fought other good men, where the Ummah bled while enemies of Islam watched and waited. The previous evening, Ali had sent a personal message to Zubair, reminding him of their shared history, their brotherhood in faith, their mutual love for the Prophet. The words had pierced through the political rhetoric and strategic considerations, reaching the core of who Zubair truly was, not a political leader, but a servant of Allah who had pledged his life to a higher cause. As dawn broke on what would become known as the Battle of the Camel, Zubair made a decision that would define his legacy. He would withdraw from this conflict. He would not raise his sword against Ali, the man the Prophet had called his brother. He would not be party to the spilling of Muslim blood in a civil war that served no godly purpose. The moment of truth. The decision to leave the battlefield was perhaps the most difficult of Zubair's life. Here was a man who had never retreated from any fight, who had earned his reputation charging into impossible odds with unwavering courage. To his allies, his withdrawal looked like abandonment. To his enemies, it might appear as cowardice. But to Zubair, it was the only choice that aligned with his conscience and his faith. As he prepared to depart, some of his closest followers begged him to reconsider. They reminded him of his commitments, of the promises made to Aisha, of the need for leadership in these troubled times. But Zubair's mind was resolved. He had spent the night in prayer and contemplation, seeking guidance from Allah, and the answer had come with startling clarity. "This is not our fight," he told his men, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "We came here seeking justice, but justice cannot be built upon the foundation of Muslim blood. I will not meet Ali in battle, for he is my brother in faith, and our swords should be turned against the enemies of Islam, not against each other." The withdrawal was conducted with dignity and honor. Zubair did not sneak away under cover of darkness like a common deserter. Instead, he openly announced his intentions and began his journey away from the battlefield, accompanied by a small group of loyal followers who respected his decision even if they didn't fully understand it. The river of reflection. Along the banks of Wadi al-Siba, Zubair found the peace he had been seeking. The sound of flowing water provided a gentle backdrop to his prayers, a stark contrast to the clash of arms and shouting of warriors that had filled his ears for weeks. Here, away from the political maneuvering and military strategy, he could simply be a Muslim standing before his Creator. The companions who had followed him respected his need for solitude. They made camp at a respectful distance, understanding that their leader needed this time for spiritual reflection. Zubair had always been a man of deep faith, but the events of recent months had tested that faith in ways he had never imagined. The unity of the early Muslim community, which had seemed so unshakable during the Prophet's lifetime, had fractured into competing factions, each claiming to represent the true path of Islam. As he performed his ablutions in the clear water of the stream, Zubair reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the early days in Mecca, when Muslims were few and persecuted, when the bond between believers was forged in shared suffering and unwavering faith. He recalled the battles against the Byzantine and Persian empires, when Muslim unity had achieved victories that seemed impossible, when the word of Allah had spread across continents through the courage and sacrifice of the faithful. How had it come to this? How had the community of believers reached a point where they drew swords against each other? These questions haunted Zubair as he prepared for what he somehow sensed might be his final prayer. The assassin's shadow, unknown to Zubair, his withdrawal from the battlefield had not gone unnoticed by all parties. Among Ali's followers was a man named Amr ibn Jurmuz, whose motivations were far from the noble ideals that drove the major players in this conflict. Ibn Jurmuz saw opportunity in chaos, advancement in betrayal, and glory in what others would call infamy. When word reached Ali's camp that Zubair had left the battlefield, most saw it as a positive development. One less opponent to face, one step closer to ending this tragic conflict. But Ibn Jurmuz saw something different, a chance to win favor with Ali by eliminating a key figure from the opposing side. In his twisted reasoning, killing Zubair would be seen as a service to the rightful caliph, an act that would surely be rewarded with position and wealth. The fact that Zubair had withdrawn from the conflict, that he no longer posed a military threat, meant nothing to Ibn Jurmuz. In his mind, enemies remained enemies regardless of their current actions. He gathered a small group of like-minded men and set out in pursuit of the departing hero, convinced that he was about to perform a service for his cause. As they tracked Zubair's small party to the banks of Wadi al-Siba, Ibn Jurmuz felt the excitement of approaching triumph. Here was Zubair ibn al-Awwam, one of the 10 promised paradise by the Prophet himself, isolated and vulnerable. The irony that he was about to attack a man who had removed himself from battle in the name of peace was lost on the assassin. The final prayer as the sun reached its zenith, Zubair felt the call to prayer resonate in his heart. He had always been meticulous about his religious obligations, but today the call seemed especially significant. Moving away from his companions to ensure he would not be disturbed, he found a quiet spot near the water where he could prostrate himself before Allah in perfect solitude. The ritual of prayer had always brought Zubair peace, but never more so than on this day. As he recited the familiar verses, he felt a profound sense of surrender, not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of a faithful servant placing his complete trust in Allah's wisdom and mercy. The political struggles, the military campaigns, the weight of leadership, all of it seemed to fade away as he focused solely on his relationship with his Creator. He recited verses from the Quran that spoke of the temporary nature of this world, of the importance of seeking Allah's pleasure above all earthly concerns, of the ultimate accountability that awaits every soul. Each word seemed to resonate with special meaning, as if Allah was speaking directly to his heart in this moment of spiritual clarity. As Zubair moved into sujood, the prostration that represents the ultimate act of submission to Allah, he experienced a profound sense of peace. His forehead touched the earth in humble acknowledgement of his Creator's sovereignty, and in that moment, all the conflicts and contradictions of his recent life seemed to resolve into perfect clarity. The moment of betrayal was in this sacred position, with his face turned toward the earth in worship, that death came to Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Ibn Jurmuz, creeping forward with the stealth of a predator, struck with a coward's blow. The great warrior, who had faced countless enemies in open battle, was killed by a treacherous attack while engaged in the most peaceful and sacred of acts. The manner of his death spoke volumes about the nature of the times. Here was a man who had removed himself from conflict out of religious conviction, killed by someone who claimed to serve the same faith. The contrast could not have been starker. Zubair died in a state of worship, while his killer acted from the basest of human motivations. Ibn Jurmuz quickly claimed Zubair's sword, the famous blade that had served in countless battles for the cause of Islam. In his deluded mind, this trophy would serve as proof of his deed and guarantee his reward. From Ali, he raced back toward the main army, eager to present his prize and claim his place among the heroes of the cause. Ali's anguish when Ibn Jurmuz appeared before Ali with Zubair's sword, expecting congratulations and rewards, he met instead with a reaction that shocked him to his core. Ali, upon recognizing the blade of his old companion, did not celebrate or offer thanks. Instead, his face contorted with grief and horror as he realized what had transpired. "Woe to you!" Ali cried out, his voice breaking with emotion. "Do you come to me expecting reward for this deed? Give glad tidings of hell to the killer of Ibn Safiyyah." The reference to Zubair by his mother's name, Safiyyah, the Prophet's aunt, emphasized the sacred bonds that Ibn Jurmuz had violated. Ali's reaction revealed the profound difference between a leader of principle and a mere opportunist. While Ibn Jurmuz had seen only political advantage in Zubair's death, Ali understood the spiritual and moral catastrophe that had just occurred. The killing of Zubair was not a victory for his cause, but a stain upon it, not a service to Islam, but a betrayal of its most fundamental values. The caliph's grief was genuine and deep. Despite their recent political differences, Ali had never stopped seeing Zubair as a brother in faith, a companion of the Prophet, and a man whose dedication to Islam was beyond question. The fact that Zubair had been killed while trying to remove himself from the conflict made the tragedy even more acute. Reports from that day describe Ali weeping openly, mourning not just for Zubair personally, but for what his death represented: the corruption of noble causes by base motivations, the way civil conflict inevitably produces such moral inversions, where the righteous are killed by those claiming to serve righteousness. The cost of civil war. Ali's anguish over Zubair's death reflected his growing understanding of the true cost of the fitna that had engulfed the Muslim community. This was not merely a political struggle for temporal power, but a spiritual crisis that was corrupting the very foundations of Islamic society. When men like Ibn Jurmuz could commit murder and expect reward, when acts of treachery could be dressed up as service to the faith, the community had lost its way. The civil war was producing precisely the kind of moral confusion and spiritual degradation that the Prophet had warned against. Muslims were not only fighting Muslims, but were beginning to justify increasingly dishonorable conduct in the name of their cause. The bright lines between right and wrong, so clear in the early days of Islam, were becoming blurred in the fog of factional conflict. For Ali, Zubair's death served as a wake-up call about the nature of the struggle he was engaged in. Victory, achieved through such means, would be no victory at all, but a defeat for everything Islam stood for. The realization that his own followers could commit such acts in his name filled him with a deep sense of responsibility and regret. A humble burial. When Zubair's body was recovered, it was treated with the respect due to one of the great companions of the Prophet. There were no elaborate funeral ceremonies, no grand monuments erected in his honor. Instead, he was buried with the simple dignity befitting a Muslim who had lived and died in service to his faith. The absence of pomp and circumstance at his funeral spoke to the changed nature of the times. In the early days of Islam, the death of such a prominent companion would have occasioned community-wide mourning and celebration of his contributions. But in the midst of civil war, even the passing of heroes became muted affairs, overshadowed by the pressing concerns of ongoing conflict. Yet perhaps this humble burial was fitting for a man who had chosen, in his final act, to remove himself from worldly conflicts in favor of spiritual priorities. Zubair had died as he had lived in his final days, focused on his relationship with Allah rather than on earthly honors and recognition. The location of his grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who remembered his contributions to Islam. Unlike the tombs of conquerors and kings, marked by grand architecture and elaborate inscriptions, Zubair's resting place served as a reminder that true greatness lies in faithful service rather than worldly achievement. Legacy of a complicated hero. Zubair ibn al-Awwam's death marked the end of an era in Islamic history. With his passing, the EA8 world lost one of the last direct links to the Prophet Muhammad's inner circle, a man who had witnessed the birth of Islam and participated in its early expansion. His complicated final chapter, involvement in civil war, followed by principled withdrawal, reflected the broader challenges facing the Muslim community in that turbulent period. His legacy raises profound questions about loyalty, principle, and the nature of righteous action in complex circumstances. Zubair's initial participation in the opposition to Ali came from genuine conviction that justice demanded accountability for Uthman's murder. His ultimate withdrawal reflected an equally genuine recognition that the cure had become worse than the disease, that civil war itself was a greater threat to Islam than any particular injustice. The manner of his death, assassination during prayer by someone claiming to serve the same cause he had once supported, serves as a powerful reminder of how noble movements can be corrupted by ignoble actors. Ibn Jurmuz's treachery was not an aberration, but a symbol of how civil conflict inevitably attracts those who seek to profit from chaos and division. The echo through time. The story of Zubair's final days continues to resonate through Islamic history as a cautionary tale about the costs of internal division. His death demonstrated how fitna, civil strife within the community of believers, inevitably leads to the corruption of Islamic values and the triumph of opportunism over principle. For subsequent generations of Muslims, Zubair's story has served as both inspiration and warning. His courage in withdrawing from a conflict he came to see as unjust inspires those who must choose between loyalty to particular leaders and loyalty to higher principles. At the same time, the circumstances of his death warn of the dangers that await communities that allow political differences to override religious brotherhood. The tragedy of Zubair ibn al-Awwam reminds us that even heroes can find themselves caught in impossible situations, where every choice seems to involve some betrayal of deeply held values. His final choice, to remove himself from conflict in favor of spiritual priorities, may not have saved his life, but it preserved his honor and provided a model for others facing similar moral dilemmas. In the end, Zubair's story teaches us the true heroism sometimes lies not in fighting to the bitter end, but in having the wisdom to recognize when a fight no longer serves the cause it was meant to defend. His death by treachery while engaged in prayer serves as a final testament to the values he ultimately chose to embrace: peace over conflict, worship over warfare, and submission to Allah over submission to worldly ambitions. The Prophet's vision in the last years of his blessed life, as the Arabian Peninsula submitted to the message of Islam and the light of faith spread across tribes and cities, the Prophet Muhammad would often gaze upon his companions with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment. These were men who had stood with him through persecution and triumph, who had bled beside him in battles and wept with him in prayer. Among these blessed souls, none held a more special place in the Prophet's heart than his own family, and none among his family exemplified the perfect fusion of courage and devotion, quite like Zubair ibn al-Awwam. One evening, as the golden light of sunset painted the modest streets of Medina, the Prophet sat surrounded by his companions in the courtyard of the mosque. The conversation had turned to the future, to the trials that would test the Ummah after his departure, to the challenges that lay ahead for those who would carry Islam's message to the world. It was then that the Prophet spoke words that would echo through the centuries. Every prophet has disciples, and my disciples are as Zubair. But perhaps even more significantly, on multiple occasions witnessed by numerous companions, he declared Zubair to be among the Ashara Mubashara, the 10 promised paradise. These were not casual words of affection. In Islamic belief, the Prophet spoke through divine inspiration, his declarations carrying the weight of prophetic knowledge. When he promised paradise to 10 specific individuals during their lifetimes, he was offering them something beyond earthly honor. He was providing a divine guarantee that transcended human judgment. For Zubair, this promise would become both his greatest comfort and his heaviest burden. How does one live knowing that paradise has been guaranteed? How does one navigate the complexities of earthly life while carrying the weight of divine expectation? The burden of certainty. The knowledge of his promised destination created a unique psychological landscape for Zubair. Unlike other believers who lived in hope mixed with uncertainty about their ultimate fate, he carried the extraordinary burden of prophetic assurance. This was not arrogance. Islamic sources consistently describe Zubair as remarkably humble, but rather a profound responsibility. Contemporary accounts describe how this knowledge affected his daily behavior. He became even more meticulous in his prayers, more generous in his charity, more careful in his speech. Yet he also carried a deep anxiety that perhaps his later actions might somehow invalidate the Prophet's promise. This tension between divine assurance and human fallibility would define his spiritual journey. Islamic scholars have noted that the 10 promised paradise were not chosen for their perfection, but rather for their sincere devotion despite human flaws. The Prophet, in his divine wisdom, saw into their hearts and recognized a purity of intention that would ultimately outweigh any earthly mistakes. This understanding becomes crucial when examining Zubair's involvement in the civil wars that would later tear the Muslim community apart. His participation in the Battle of the Camel alongside Aisha against Ali was not born of malice or ambition, but from a sincere belief that he was defending justice and the true principles of Islam. Scholarly consensus. Through the ages, across the centuries following Zubair's death, Islamic scholars from different schools of thought have maintained a remarkable consensus about his spiritual status. This agreement transcends the usual sectarian divisions that have sometimes fractured Islamic intellectual discourse. The great Sunni scholars, from the early traditionists like Ibn Sa'd and al-Tabari, to later luminaries like Ibn Kathir and as-Suyuti, have consistently upheld Zubair's position among the Ashara Mubashara. They emphasize his early conversion, his unwavering loyalty to the Prophet, and his military service in establishing the Islamic State. More significantly, they contextualize his role in the civil wars within the framework of ijtihad, the principle that sincere scholars can reach different conclusions on complex issues while remaining righteous in God's sight. According to this view, both Zubair and Ali were striving to serve Islam's best interests. They simply disagreed about the proper course of action. The Hanbali scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, known for his rigorous analysis of early Islamic history, wrote extensively about the fitna, trials, that followed Uthman's assassination. He argued that all the major participants, including Zubair, Ali, and Muawiyah, were sincere Muslims whose political disagreements should not diminish their spiritual status. Similarly, contemporary scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi and Muhammad al-Ghazali have emphasized that the political conflicts of the early Islamic period must be understood within their historical context, without allowing later sectarian narratives to cloud our judgment of the individuals involved. The Shia perspective, honoring despite division. Perhaps even more remarkable is the respect accorded to Zubair within Shia scholarship, despite his opposition to Ali ibn Abi Talib, whom Shias consider the rightful successor to the Prophet. This respect stems from several factors that transcend political disagreements. First, Shia scholars acknowledge Zubair's close family relationship to the Prophet. As the son of Safiya, the Prophet's aunt, Zubair shared blood ties that are deeply respected in Islamic culture. More importantly, his marriage to Asma bint Abu Bakr connected him to one of the most honored women in early Islamic history. Second, his early conversion and unwavering support during the Meccan persecution earn him recognition as one of the Sabiqun al-Awwalun, the early forerunners in faith. Shia historical sources consistently acknowledge his role in protecting the early Muslim community and his sacrifices for the cause of Islam. The renowned Shia scholar al-Majlisi, while critical of Zubair's later political choices, nevertheless recognized his sincerity and spiritual rank. He argued that Zubair's error lay in political judgment, not in matters of faith or character. This distinction between political disagreement and spiritual condemnation reflects a sophisticated understanding of human complexity. Contemporary Shia scholars have continued this tradition of respectful disagreement. They honor Zubair's contributions to Islam while maintaining their critique of his opposition to Ali. This nuanced approach demonstrates the possibility of acknowledging both someone's spiritual worth and their political mistakes. Stories of character. The man beyond the legend. To understand why both Sunni and Shia scholars have maintained such respect for Zubair despite political divisions, we must examine the character traits that consistently emerge from historical accounts. These stories, passed down through multiple chains of transmission, paint a portrait of a man whose basic character transcended political circumstances. One of the most frequently cited examples of Zubair's honesty involves a business dispute during the caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab. A merchant accused Zubair of cheating him in a transaction involving a large sum of money. Rather than dismissing the accusation or relying on his status as a companion of the Prophet, Zubair immediately opened his financial records for public scrutiny. When the investigation proved his innocence, many advised him to seek compensation from his false accuser. Instead, Zubair forgave the man and even provided him with a loan to help his struggling business. "The Prophet taught us that wealth is a test," he reportedly said. "My test is not in earning it, but in how I treat those who question my earning of it." His humility was equally legendary. Despite his guaranteed place in paradise and his status as one of Islam's greatest military heroes, Zubair maintained a simple lifestyle that often surprised visitors. The historian al-Waqidi records that when foreign dignitaries came to meet this famous companion of the Prophet, they were often shocked to find him personally tending to his horses and mending his own equipment. One particularly touching story involves his relationship with his servants. Unlike many wealthy Arabs of his time, Zubair treated his household staff as extended family members. He personally taught them to read and write, encouraged them to marry and establish their own families, and frequently freed slaves as acts of charity. When asked about this unusual behavior, he replied, "The Prophet said that paradise is forbidden to those who show arrogance toward others. I would rather err on the side of humility than risk losing what has been promised to me." His devotion to prayer was another defining characteristic. Even during military campaigns, Zubair would find ways to maintain his spiritual practices. Soldiers under his command reported seeing him rise for pre-dawn prayers, regardless of weather or circumstances. During the Battle of Yarmouk, witnesses observed him performing ablution with precious water while surrounded by enemies, refusing to compromise his ritual purity even in life-threatening situations. The next generation. Abdullah ibn Zubair's torch. Perhaps no one understood the weight of Zubair's legacy better than his son Abdullah, who would later attempt to carry forward his father's vision of Islamic governance during one of the most turbulent periods in Islamic history. Abdullah ibn Zubair represents both the promise and the tragedy of inherited noble purpose. Born into a family where paradise was promised and greatness expected, Abdullah grew up surrounded by the companions of the Prophet and immersed in the stories of early Islamic heroism. His mother, Asma bint Abu Bakr, was herself a figure of immense importance, the daughter of the first caliph and a woman who had personally witnessed the Prophet's migration to Medina. This exceptional lineage created both opportunity and burden. Abdullah possessed his father's courage and his grandfather, Abu Bakr's administrative acumen, but he also inherited their uncompromising nature and their sometimes inflexible adherence to principle over pragmatism. When the Umayyad dynasty consolidated power after Ali's assassination and Hassan's abdication, Abdullah ibn Zubair found himself in an impossible position. He genuinely believed that the Umayyads had corrupted the Islamic ideal, transforming the caliphate from a spiritual institution into a dynastic monarchy. Yet his attempts to restore what he saw as authentic Islamic governance led to civil war and ultimately his own tragic death. The parallels between father and son are striking. Both men possessed unquestionable courage and sincere devotion to Islamic principles. Both found themselves opposing what they saw as deviations from the Prophet's teachings. Both ultimately died as a result of their political choices, yet both maintain their spiritual integrity throughout their struggles. Abdullah's rebellion against the Umayyads can be seen as an extension of his father's participation in the Battle of the Camel, a sincere but ultimately futile attempt to preserve what they believed to be the authentic spirit of early Islam. The tragedy lies not in their intentions, which were noble, but in their inability to find peaceful solutions to complex political problems. The complexity of loyalty. The story of Zubair ibn al-Awwam ultimately raises one of the most profound questions in human experience. What does it mean to be truly loyal when every choice carries a cost? This question becomes even more poignant when viewed through the lens of religious faith and prophetic promise. Zubair's dilemma was not unique to his time or his faith tradition. Throughout history, individuals of conscience have faced moments when their deepest loyalties come into conflict. Do you remain loyal to a person or to a principle? Do you support a friend even when you disagree with their actions? Do you maintain institutional loyalty when you believe the institution has lost its way? For Zubair, these questions were not abstract philosophical exercises but lived realities with eternal consequences. His loyalty to the Prophet was absolute and never wavered. His loyalty to the early Islamic community was equally strong. But when that community fractured into competing factions, each claiming to represent authentic Islam, how could he choose without betraying someone or something he held sacred? The traditional Islamic understanding of Zubair's choices emphasizes the concept of ijtihad, the principle that sincere believers can reach different conclusions about complex issues while maintaining their spiritual integrity. This principle recognizes that human beings, even those with the best intentions and the deepest faith, cannot always see clearly through the fog of competing claims and conflicting loyalties. Modern psychologists might describe Zubair's situation as a classic case of cognitive dissonance, the mental stress experienced when holding contradictory beliefs or values. His love for Ali as the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law conflicted with his concerns about the circumstances of Uthman's death and the implications for Islamic governance. His respect for Aisha as the Prophet's wife and his own family connections to her faction created additional layers of complexity. Yet rather than condemning him for his inability to navigate these impossible choices perfectly, both Sunni and Shia scholarship has generally recognized the sincerity of his struggle. This recognition reflects a mature understanding that being human means living with uncertainty and making imperfect choices based on incomplete information. The eternal question. As we conclude our examination of Zubair ibn al-Awwam's legacy, we return to the question that has haunted thoughtful observers across the centuries. In a world of competing loyalties and imperfect choices, how do we define true faithfulness? Perhaps the answer lies not in the perfection of our choices, but in the sincerity of our intentions and the consistency of our core values. Zubair never wavered in his devotion to God, his love for the Prophet, or his commitment to what he understood to be Islamic principles. When faced with impossible political circumstances, he chose what he believed to be right, even knowing that his choice might cost him everything. The Prophet's promise of paradise was not based on Zubair's political acumen or his ability to navigate complex situations without error. It was based on something deeper, a purity of heart and a sincerity of faith that transcended earthly circumstances. This understanding offers hope to all believers who struggle with the gap between their ideals and their reality, between their aspirations and their limitations. In the end, Zubair ibn al-Awwam stands as a reminder that true greatness is not measured by the absence of mistakes, but by the presence of sincere devotion. His legacy challenges us to examine our own loyalties, to consider the cost of our choices, and to strive for the kind of integrity that earned him a place among those promised paradise. The lion of faith roars not with the voice of perfection, but with the cry of sincere struggle in the face of impossible choices. And in that roar, we hear an echo of our own spiritual journey, imperfect, conflicted, but ultimately guided by love for the divine and hope for redemption. His story reminds us that loyalty, like faith itself, is not a destination, but a journey. One that requires constant navigation between competing demands, eternal vigilance against our own limitations, and ultimate trust in the mercy of the one who sees not just our actions, but our hearts.